Listen, listen, listen with your inner ear.
The workshop, if you believed all the letters in the back of the Radio Times, featured sounds that nobody liked for plays that nobody could understand. It was a very alien art form, and because of the nature of the equipment we had, we were excellent at producing harsh, frightening, distorted sounds.
The early years of the workshop, the tape music is all found sounds, you say bottle noises and clanging rulers. Then there came the synthesizer era where sort of tape music, because it was so labour intensive, it would take weeks to make a couple of minutes of music, that sort of disappeared, and so everything went very synthesizer for a while. And then of course samplers came in, and so the found sound started to be used again.
We were in the vanguard, you might say, at the very beginning of the 70s, of people who were using experimental synthesizers. At first they weren't as slick and didn't perform as well as some of the later synthesizers. On the other hand, it was a place where you could explore sounds in a whole new, different sort of way.
No presets, so you couldn't just push a button and get that sound that somebody spent a few weeks, conjuring up. You had to just make every single one. So they were all unique sounds at that stage.
I mean, usually you did all the backgrounds first. You created all the ambiances with loops of tape and reverberation and playing things backwards and things like that. And then you'd get onto the more detailed spot effects. And then came the day when the producer or director came over and you played it to him. We offered an all-round service at the workshop. We'd even do a sort of helpline if somebody rang up with a problem, or you want a rocket takeoff, right, we'll get one off the shelf, no point in making another one.
I was a child of the 1960s, and all of the television and radio schools programs we had at that time had soundtracks by the Radiophonic Workshop. So I used to stand in a drafty playground pretending to be a tree to the sound of Jenneth Worsley and Delia Derbyshire. So I grew up with these sounds, and it became a part of my DNA. The sound of the Radiophonic Workshop is the sound of my childhood. And then of course I became fascinated by Doctor Who.
Brian and I spent probably days making this TARDIS go off onto endless space. That was Brian scraping the bass strings of an old exposed piano frame with his mum's front door key. I made a sort of discipline for myself that if any of the monsters were organic, i.e. they appeared to be living, I would only make their lifestyle noises from organic sounds. If the threat came from a mechanical thing, then I would create that from electronic and synthetic sounds.
The whole of sound design has changed enormously in the last 50 years. In the early 60s and right up to really the late 80s when Doctor Who, sort of classic Doctor Who, finished, there wasn't these enormous sound libraries you've got now. So if you wanted a sound, you had to make it. One of the fascinating things about early Doctor Who is every monster, the door sounds different, the gun sounds different, because they're all original sounds. Nowadays, if you want an alarm sound, you go to a library and you pull an alarm sound out.
What we couldn't do, we had to sort of invent ways round it. We decided if some chap on attachment with us devised a vibrato. What he did was to get a separate recording replay head on an arm, mount it on an eccentric on an old gramophone motor, anchor it down with a biscuit tin made of sand, filled with sand to hold it in position, and then as the tape came away from the tape machine, he'd wind it up on another machine, so it gave him a big length, and he'd just put this head against this 1/4-inch tape in space going by and waggle it backwards and forwards. I mean, Desmond had a wonderful quote, he seemed to be full of them. Because we weren't experts, we didn't know what we shouldn't be capable of doing. And once you get your head around that, well, that's our excuse for generally working out as it comes.
You know, if this is Southend, there's something very odd about it. What, do you mean the way the sea stays steady as a rock? And the buildings keep washing up and down?
Most people say to us at one time or another, I bet you're inspired by Mr. Stockhausen. Or what about Pierre Schaeffer, and what about, you know, musique concrète and all that. We knew that their problems must have been the same as our problems, and great, but they were doing it to satisfy their own creative ambitions.
We were working in a very different way to them and to most musicians outside. We had deadlines and we had specific things we had to do. So brief. It wasn't like you can do any bit of music you want.
One of the most important things to remember about the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, it wasn't set up like the European electronic music workshops were as an arts establishment. It wasn't set up as a fine art department. It was set up as a commercial department to service programmes.
You could carry on going to work and doing your thing in your studio to the briefs that came through the door for you to do, and you wouldn't actually refer to the outside world as much as people might think. Later on, when you discover, you know, for instance, I discovered a website where I actually appear alongside Vangelis as somebody using CS80, the Yamaha CS80. Well, obviously at the time, that recurred to me in a million years. It was anything to do with Vangelis. I was just doing it, you know. So it's retrospectively you find these things out, but I don't think it makes so much difference at the time.
Paul McCartney had a consultation session with Dealey Derbyshire.
Yeah.
I believe Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones came in at one point. Another occasion, a mutual friend brought Mike Oldfield round. He was very interested to see what went on there. I don't think he was particularly influenced by it.
But someone like Mike Oldfield was doing very much what you were doing. He was, you know, working on his own in the studio, playing all the instruments himself, overdubbing himself, multi-tracking himself, creating, you know, whole orchestrations from scratch. And that's exactly what you were doing, and I think there is an enormous influence in what you were doing.
It's really fantastic to be talking about it all this long afterwards, and even playing it live.
Some of the things that we play were originally buried under a load of actors and,
Sound effects.
all that sort of stuff, sound effects and that sort of thing. So we're able to play stuff without those sort of slightly unnecessary layers of audio.
We don't just want to be our own tribute band, you know. As Peter said, we're very keen on writing new work. And one of the fascinating things that certainly Peter and I are very interested in is taking all those old analogue techniques, because now there are digital ways of doing the old analogue techniques. And so we're mixing it up a lot. You know, we're mixing the old techniques with the new techniques. That's why we have on stage everything from quarter-inch tape machines, which we are using live, to analogue synthesizers, which go out of tune live. That's very authentic. To the latest in digital technology as well. So it's really mixing it up and using the different technologies.
New stuff, I think, has the kind of spirit of the old stuff. That's what I hope it does anyway. Because what we're doing really is we're representing a lot of people who didn't make it this long, who really did, you know, build that enormous reputation back in the 50s.
I turned up, I stayed there for 30 odd years, never knowing what I was going to do within reason from day to day. And I actually ended up getting an honorary doctorate at Bradford University. I'm a doctor of science. My daughter-in-law says, no, you should be a doctor of who, which I think sums it up.